It's a new day on Deep Space Nine, and we're throwing a party for a new member of the Defiant crew. Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim is what Starfleet considers a skilled pilot, and everybody's jolly glad to have somebody who hits fewer than 50% of the objects he flies near. Nobody's more glad than Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim himself, who has to be forced into ending the festivities long after nearly everybody else has called it a day. Dax deposits him in his quarters and leaves him to sleep it off. She wakes in the morning and is preparing for work when she hears not insignificant noise outside of her quarters. A lot of people are running in the same direction, so she joins them. We're led to the quarters of Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim, and it would appear that nominative determinism has struck once again. In this case, he's been shot, and we don't mean that in a 24th century way. No pooping of various colours here, as some buggers put a small piece of metal inside the lad. The bullet's made of future metal, which jogs the memory of Sisko and O'Brien about a certain prototype Starfleet weapon for use in environments where science wibblies make energy weapons useless. Chemical reactions propelling solid slugs may be crude, but sometimes crude is exactly what you want. The prototype in question, designated TR-116, was ultimately abandoned, but then so was the Defiant, and we've got one of those buggers parked at the station. Anybody with sufficient clearance could have called up the pattern and replicated one, meaning every single Starfleet officer on the station is now a murder suspect. Odd thing, though, the shot was point blank, but there's no residue on the lad's chest. We'll add that mystery to why anybody would want to kill someone who's only been here for just over a week and was well liked. Murders are a little close to home for Dax, something she discusses with Bashir when he finds her watching over the ordnance coffin of Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim. Jiran is the Dax host rarely spoken of, which is understandable when he was partial to a bit of the old killing. As a result, Dax has memories of committing 3 murders. The conversation is probably why Dax is having a nightmare later on. Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim is being dragged away for his own murder, Dax has blood on her hands, then murder boy Jiran says hi. It's not just a social call, though. He wants to help Dax solve the murder, and for the low price of loosening the collar around his throat for a little while. Who better to catch a murderer than a murderer? She wakes up when he makes them both take a dive off the promenade railing and is greeted by a call from Sisko. Our murderer has just been upgraded to a serial killer. Lieutenant Commander's second corpse has taken a bullet to the heart, just like our first victim, but that, and them both working in Starfleet, is where the similarities end. She was a science officer, had been here for a few years, and there's no indication they knew each other. On the plus side, at least we might have an answer on how it was done now. Bashir and O'Brien are talking about the Alamo as they eat, specifically some of the legends surrounding Davy Crockett, one of Texas's favorite slave owners. A particularly inventive myth had him ricocheting bullets to hit a target, which gives O'Brien an idea on how our serial killer is doing the deed. To a lab we go where Dax and Odo watch a purple melon explode for no reason. Not really, of course, as it's actually been shot by O'Brien using a TR-116 rifle with a tiny teleporter strapped to the barrel. Making the bullet appear right in front of the target means it's still technically point blank, but with no chemical residue. A science bollocks eyepiece means we can see through solid matter, all of which gives us a murderer who could be shooting at anywhere on the station from anywhere else on the station. The whole situation has got people jumpy, so it's not entirely surprising that Worf's keeping an eye on Dax along the promenade later. He says he'd have done the same for anybody, which gives them both an out for not talking about the real reason. Instead, she says there's a way to help the investigation, but it's not something she'd welcome. Worf thinks she'll do it anyway, which either provides the strength or the peer pressure to make it true. One Trill ceremony later, and she's talking to the summoned personality of Jiran. It's all in her head, of course, but she can still have a proper conversation with him now. And he's got plenty to say. He thinks understanding the killer is key, and that requires going through the motions. Holding the weapon is part of it, but using it in the same way as whoever's shooting people is more important. She scans through corridors and rooms until she finds someone alone in their quarters. Jiran's asking about her mental state, and she's surprised to find she's quite distant from the situation, more analysis than rage. Jiran thinks that might be indicative of character, then tells Dax the only way to truly know the killer is to pull the trigger, and orders her to do so. She tells him to balls and puts down the gun, only to be reminded it's not loaded. He just wanted to see how far she'd go. Jiran's apologizing for trying to engage her murder mode, a conversation with herself that Quark overhears half of. She ignores Jiran to make Quark believe she's fine, then Jiran talks about killing him when he's gone. Perhaps that's why Dax decides this business partnership should end as soon as possible. To the quarters of the victims we go as Jiran thinks we should have another look. Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim first. His quarters are sparse as he's new here, but there's a picture of him with some other cadets at the academy. One's dead and the other's on a ship elsewhere, so it's not either of them. Lieutenant Commander's second corpse has a whole lot more going on in her place. Clutter abounds, part of it being a frame with a short video clip of her wedding day. The marriage is another thing she doesn't have in common with Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim, and Dax can't see any connection. She's arguing with Jiran in Quark's afterwards, him saying Dax isn't putting her whole self into this, when there's a commotion. Security is chasing a Starfleet officer, so she assumes it's the murderer and joins in. The guy in question doesn't care for this and twats her, so Jiran tells her to grab a weapon and solve the problem permanently. She's still holding a knife over the guy when Odo turns up and takes it from her. Sisko's rather curious why Dax would be on the cusp of shanking a lad when he hears about it. Dax explains she was trying to stop a murderer, only to be told he's not our guy. Okay, he was being chased because he replicated a TR-116 rifle, but he only did that because he's a collector of exotic weapons. He was also on Bajor when Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim lived up to his name, and that's a shot even the TR-116 couldn't pull off. Suitably admonished, Dax returns to her quarters. She's decided Jiran's not worth the hassle, and, ignoring his protestations, starts up a ceremony that will presumably pop him back in his cage. She's interrupted before she finishes, and is called elsewhere. Petty Officer Hattrick has gained a new piercing, though I imagine the aftercare is going to be a bit of a bugger. A Bolian victim means this whole business isn't limited to humans, removing one of the few similarities between the first two. The rest of the crime scene crew are gone when Dax takes a look around. She finds a picture of him and his kids, which makes 3 frames for 3 victims, and she's also realized they were all laughing. Jiran suggests that might make emotion the connection, and the murder method being coldly analytical seems to back it up. That puts Vulcans at the top of the list for suspects then, which is a problem when there are 48 of them here. Narrowing it down to those who've experienced personal tragedies still leaves 28. There's a war on, after all. We'll need a bit of serendipity to wrap this one up, and the universe delivers by putting us in the same lift as a Vulcan. Jiran decides it's him immediately and tells Dax as much. She tries to open a conversation with him and is rebuffed, then he leaves. Checking his personnel file back in her quarters reveals he's one of the very few survivors from a ship that got kaboomed by Jem'Hadar. Dax still isn't 100% on it being him, so Jiran tells her to take a peek in his quarters and see what he's up to right now. The answer is looking at the personnel file of Dax, which seems only fair when she's just done the same. Him fetching a TR-116 rifle afterwards is a bit more dodgy, so Jiran tells Dax to shoot the bastard. She does so just as he's lining up a shot on her, and Jiran is delighted. Jiran's less delighted when we get to the lad's quarters and discover he's still alive. Urging her to finish it does nothing. She instead calls for medical assistance, while Jiran has a bit of a pout. Dax is putting Jiran back in his cage. He doesn't seem too bothered about it this time. He knows he's already weakened the lock by being here, and that means he won't be hidden away like he was for the last 2 hosts, so we'll leave Dax to deal with the prospect of having a murderer whispering in her head until the next adventure. It's been a whole 6 seasons since we had a good old-fashioned murder mystery. A man alone from Season 1 used the premise to help us understand a little of the underlying bigotry Odo's had to deal with during his life, and how quickly that can bubble to the surface when given an excuse. Here it's instead aimed at giving us a chance to see more of how Dax's past hosts work in the Gestalt, which means our analysis will be diving into the concept of joined Trill consciousness once again. We've already seen in the episode Facets from Season 3 that each host personality can be decanted into surrogates. Today's story is a derivative of the same idea, right up to using the same boiling goop as we did for the Jintara ritual. Tangentially, I wonder if that bubbly brown is purely symbolic or has a more practical purpose. Might the fumes carry psychoactive properties, stimulating the ability to isolate consciousness? You don't want prior hosts popping in for a chat at random, so requiring a deliberate chemical trigger as well as the chanting makes sense. Think of it as two-factor authentication for your brain. Anywho, what we learn from this one is that the separation of past host thoughts is possible by means other than the Jintara ritual. Being able to speak solely to a single consciousness rather than just access their memories has its uses. Learning gymnastics would be a lot easier if Ezri decided to pull out Emily as a personal trainer, for example. It sounds like there's a downside, though. Jiran's now of the opinion that his memories and personality will no longer be as restricted as they were before she called upon him, and that might explain why we've not seen former hosts without using surrogates previously. We've spoken before about either a single host or the blend of personalities having the potential to subsume the current host's will. If the ritual we see here has the side effect of strengthening the presence of whoever's called upon, it's logical to conclude that also increases the likelihood of a Goa'uld situation. And might that in turn explain why the host selection process is so rigorous and places such emphasis on those with strong wills of their own? People who default to outsourcing their problems rather than facing them personally might be more tempted to defer to previous hosts regardless of the risks. For those of you who think that's a stretch, well, we already live in a world where some people have jumped at the chance to delegate their own thinking, firm in the belief that not needing to write their own emails is worth a little bit of glue in their pizza. If Elon was given a symbiont, do you really think he could resist summoning up a comedian every time he went to a party just to make him look cool? All of which I suppose could be summarized by the line, "With great power comes great responsibility," a quote often attributed to Spider-Man, but has a far longer history in other forms. A Trill symbiont may carry the collected wisdom of those that came before, but each taste costs a portion of your own mind. Speaking of which, we had a rather mentally focused episode, didn't we? Our antagonist was a Vulcan turned to murder, and that ties into a topic we've touched on a few times before. The Vulcan attitude to emotion can be a curious one. For some, a philosophy of personal suppression has become distaste for emotion in others. What we see here is the extreme end of that spectrum. If you want to take a step back, that opens up questions about how a mental break might affect other species. Might Klingons experiencing psychological stress become overly affectionate? Might a cardigan start being offended by the very concept of lies? Most of the trauma reactions we've seen from other species have paralleled that of humans, which itself leads us into the broader question of how alien we can make our aliens before we have to spend half of the episode explaining it. As much as I like to see cultural exploration, there's a good narrative reason behind most of them being very similar to humans. Saying that Bolians experience grief through violent gastrointestinal eruptions might make them more unique, but would the story really be improved by a scene where the homicide detectives have to explain why they're wearing nose plugs? Let's end this one with a line from the episode that appealed to me. As Dax is having her nightmare sequence, Odo gives us the phrase, "There's nothing more annoying than a corpse with a mind of its own." It's made in relation to Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim, and in that context, not a particularly good line. But it's also the shot just before we introduce Jiran, and when taking both of those things together, it becomes significantly more clever. The line describes precisely what Jiran and the rest of the hosts are, corpses with minds of their own. And it's how Jiran behaves for the rest of the episode too, essentially becoming a ghost only Dax can see. It could be a coincidence, I suppose, but I'd like to credit our writers with a little more skill than that, so we'll give some points to whoever came up with it. And before we go, there's another couple of entries in the Babylon 5 crossover club to boot. Lieutenant Imminent Murder Victim, played by Art Chudabala, was also Private Young in the Season 2 episode Gropos. And this particular version of Jiran was played by Lee McCloskey. He was Thomas in a pair of Season 5 episodes called A Tragedy of Telepaths and Phoenix Rising. End of episode.
Any joy?
Nothing.
Why would the search engine bring us to an abandoned bus station based on a photo of an unnamed northeast town in England?
It's Bridlington.
Don't spoil it.
A couple of people in the comments of the last one already figured it out.
Typical fucking nerds. They're as bad as the buggers who found that secret room a couple of years back.
Wait, the what?
Nothing. So anyway, what's the point of us being here, do you think?
Well, the search engine seemed to think this is where it came from, so we can't just dismiss it.
I mean, one of them did burst into flames before, didn't it?
A fair point, but let's assume the guy who makes these brought us here for a reason.
Fine. Alright, if this place made the search engines, then maybe it operates on the same rules.
Good idea. We summoned the search engine by literally calling for it. Maybe that'll work here.
Yeah, why not? Excuse me, but may I speak to whoever's in charge, please?
What manner of
insect dares summon me?
Oh, bollocks.